Hello world of YouTube and welcome to another episode of ARC, the show where I get to be an asshole reviewing comics, and this video acts as another entry in the Year of the Spider. Spider-Man, just whatever a spider can. A year-long celebration I started this year to celebrate New York's favorite webhead, and I figured because Spider-Man is a comic book character, I would do a couple arcs talking about Spider-Man stories featuring different Spider-Men from across the Spider-Verse. And I figured my first arc in this series of arcs would be one featuring the original Spider-Man, Peter Parker, during a run that was very big for the character. His 1990s run that was started and had some popular stories penned by Todd McFarlane. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the Revenge of the Sinister 6 arc, which ran from Spider-Man issues 18 through 23, featured work from Eric Larson, Rick Parker, Tom DeFalco, Gregory Wright, Danny Fingeroth, who does a lot of fun editorial stuff throughout these issues. This story chronicles the Sinister Six getting their revenge, but it doesn't start off that way, and it's a story with a lot of dynamics going throughout, and it even have some moments that harken back to an arc that I had already previously talked about on the show, and also ties into some of the elements I've talked about throughout the Year of the Spider thus far. I've played the two late 90s, early 2000s Activision Spider-Man games, and it has a lot of elements that I enjoy in a good Spider-Man story, and handles a lot of those elements relatively well. I do like the art in a lot of these comics, and I like how it gets right to the action. It starts off with a really just jarring action piece featuring Ghost Rider fighting this rogue cyborg. It was so jarring, in fact, I actually looked back to see if, similarly to Blade, I was just missing some of the context, but I wasn't. It just starts with the cyborg. I like how it sets up something that does get paid off later on in the story. I also enjoy that it kind of embodies a lot of what this story has going on. It's massive crossovers with a lot of action. Make no mistake, Spider-Man is still a focal point of this, and there is a whole subplot involving him and MJ's relationship, but there are a lot of people in this comic book. You've got the Hulk popping in for a couple issues, Deathlock popping in for a couple issues, and they tie elements of their stories, or at least Deathlock's story, into the main story pretty gracefully as well. I enjoyed this story quite a bit, TBH. I like how, similarly to Spider-Man 2000, they do have these sort of cameo inserts as well. Like, Nova just straight up cameos in this comic a couple of times, but then he just kind of fucks off and does his own thing. The same thing happens with Sleepwalker, and I think that it's a really funny fucking joke. And you've also got Solo cropping in throughout pockets of the story, which, admittedly, he's one of the few cooks in the kitchen I don't care all that much about. I don't know Solo, I don't read Solo's comics, I don't read Solo's stories, and I'm not as invested on what he's got going on as I am Spider-Man and Ghost Rider and the interactions they have with some of the Sinister Six, and even Doc Ock in this, who's the main headpiece villain in all of this, as usual. I like how his story does what I kind of alluded to in my Tom Holland trilogy thing, is it presents almost an upgrade of that street-level Spider-Man into bigger territories. Because after the intro fight with Ghost Rider and the Cyborg, you do have Doc Ock committing this huge heist for his adamantium arms that he just received by killing the person who gave him the arms, the dealer that gave him the adamantium for his arms. He just straight up kills him and his army, which is a cold move, and he really feels so ruthless throughout this entire comic. You know, he straight up freezes the Sandman, who's also in the story, and throughout the story tries to show Spider-Man that he is trying to be a reformed villain, trying to turn over a new leaf, and I appreciate that. I appreciate the steps that it does try to advance his character in a different direction as well. Like I said, there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen in this, but I feel like they're all utilized really well. The Hulk, while in a handful of these comics, is Professor Hulk at this point, and is sort of adding quips with Spider-Man, and they've called attention to that a handful of times in the comics. It's really great. And by and large, I think they weave around the stories they want to tell pretty gracefully. You know, while Deathlock is sort of teased in the comic prior. When he gets to his issue, Spider-Man's also going through a cybernetic rebirth of sorts because Solo fucks Spider-Man up in an issue, and it's an insanely good use of Mysterio, which I'll get to in a second. The usage of the villains in this comic, pretty aces by and large. But I like that with Deathlock, you get Spider-Man interacting with this cyborg and sort of warning him and hoping to get answers with the lab that made him through Spider-Man, because of the same lab made Deathlock, made Spider-Man's cybernetic cast that he had to be put in. Along with being behind the cyborg that Ghost Rider and Spider-Man were fighting in the beginning of the story. I like that the scale of the story teases being way above street-level Spider-Man as well, with them just casually hopping to another dimension, and them bringing over a gigantic creature from that dimension for them to fight in the climax. It, again, just all the elements coerce and weave throughout each other fantastically by and large. You know, I talked about Ghost Rider cropping up in this comic a couple times, but I like that the Hobgoblin is here, because like I mentioned in the Spider-Man Ghost Rider arc, they have a history with the Hobgoblin, and that feels purposefully done to have Ghost Rider fighting him during their sequence where the huge climax of everybody fighting each other happens, which also just feels very self-indulgent in the way that this story would come to its head. There's a montage in the beginning of this where all of the people that Spider-Man's been trying to get a hold of finally answer the call, and it's a hilarious moment. There's some good laughs to be had in this, by and large, and like I said, this comic is very strong. But to shift it into what I would say is my least favorite element of the story, it would be the Peter Parker plotline, because it's a Spider-Man story. It's not just going to be about his Spider-Man adventures. His life is going to be factored into it, and at this point in the story, Mary Jane and Peter are married, and Mary Jane is a burgeoning actress. She's really trying to get her foot in the door, and she lands a role that could really help her career in the form of a role with Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was huge in the 90s. But the caveat is that it would be a nude scene, which Peter takes a lot of issue with, and amidst Mary Jane helping Peter by sewing his costume back together and mending his wounds in the ways that she can, that sort of is the conflict that's sort of their problem of the issue, or problem of the story. And while I think it's an important issue for them to tackle, both from dissecting the entertainment industry perspective, while also looking at the male gaze in the world of comic books, I think that it's a very smart thing for it to tackle. Hell, I even think the way they draw MJ in the comic could help enhance discussing the commentary of male gaze in comics, and I think Peter's stance feels very apropos for where I feel like the scene was very much at the time, and while it may sound a little dated on paper, I like that MJ does call him out on his almost traditionalist viewpoint and wishes he could be a little more progressive, something that I think is a bold stance to take when writing in a comic like this. I think that it reaches an understandable resolution, and sort of Mary Jane's perspective does become shifted when she decides to confront the issue, which I think was a smart way to tackle it. It just kind of sticks out like a big old light amidst this comic book. I think that it creates this interesting conversation amidst this flashy action comic in a way that it probably is smart. It's meant to just bring up the discussion, I'm sure. I just think it kind of felt clumsy in the pockets that it was introduced. You know, it's a good concept and a good idea, but maybe I would have saved it for an issue series that wasn't so full of so many freaking people. This comic was stacked with characters. Like, this is the last issue's grand 3-page pullout cover, because there's so many people in this comic that the Mary Jane conflict of doing a nude scene and how that could affect her potential future and stuff. Maybe just save it for a different issue. There was also a side story with Mary Jane in 2 of the issues called Diabolique. I didn't actually read it when I was reading the comic itself, but it further enhances the point of why include this other pretty socially conscious subplot in a very busy story instead of telling it in its own side story like you did Diabolique. very strange to me. But either way, I liked that it was here, and I liked the story as a whole. I'd recommend reading it if you like seeing Spider-Man interact with a lot of heroes and villains. If you want to see what so many people want to get out of a star-studded Spider-Man story, this is a good place to look. You know, it's got a lot of good stuff in it, IMO. It just feels a bit clumsy at points, and it could be because they're juggling so much stuff at once. Sometimes some of the balls have got to fall a little awkwardly. But either way, that's going to wrap up this arc. What did you think about it? Did you like it? Did you not? Let me know in the comments down below. If you're excited for me to talk about more Spider-Man this year, sound off in the comments down below. Again, I'm doing stories on different Spider-Men across the Spider-Verse, so hopefully you're excited for that. But I'm going to get out of here. Thank you again so very much for watching. If you liked, give it a like. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. And special thanks to my patrons if you want to join the ranks to get early access to content, exclusive content, or to help drive the community. It's linked in the description. I'm going to get out of here, though. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lives, and situations, and I'll see you another day.